What happens when a young soldier's training collides with royal protocol? When duty meets danger in the space of a heartbeat? On a seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning at Windsor Castle, Private James Mitchell made a decision that would change his life forever. In the 3 seconds it took for a black Bentley to approach his checkpoint, he chose to follow his orders rather than bow to tradition. The car's passenger, the future King of England. The consequence? A diplomatic incident that revealed the hidden tensions between security and ceremony in the modern monarchy. This is the story of one man's split-second choice that stopped a king's car and exposed the complex machinery of royal protection that most people never see. The morning mist hung low over the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Private James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic and checked his rifle one final time. At 22 years old, he had been stationed at the historic fortress for only 6 weeks, but he had already learned that every day brought its own set of challenges. The ancient walls that had protected British royalty for nearly 1,000 years now served as his workplace, and the weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. James came from a small town in Yorkshire where his father worked in a coal mine and his mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. When he enlisted in the Grenadier Guards, his parents had been proud but worried. Military service ran in their family, but none of his relatives had ever been assigned to protect the royal family. The honor came with intense scrutiny and expectations that sometimes felt overwhelming. The Castle Guard training had been unlike anything James experienced during his basic military preparation. Every movement was choreographed, every response rehearsed until it became instinct. The instructors drilled into him and his fellow guards that their primary duty was security, not ceremony. While tourists might see them as decorative figures in their distinctive uniforms, the reality was far different. They were highly trained soldiers with real weapons and the authority to use them. On this particular Tuesday, James had drawn the morning shift at the King George IV Gate, one of the main entrances to the castle grounds. The position required constant vigilance as vehicles came and went throughout the day. Staff members, delivery trucks, maintenance crews, and occasional official visitors all passed through his checkpoint. Each vehicle needed proper identification and clearance before proceeding into the secure areas of the castle. The briefing that morning had been routine. Sergeant Williams, a veteran of 15 years royal duty, had reviewed the day's expected activities and reminded the guards of current security protocols. There had been no mention of any special visits or changes to normal procedures. The king was in residence, which meant heightened awareness, but otherwise it seemed like it would be a typical day. As James took his position, he reflected on the strange contrast between the castle's ancient architecture and its modern security systems. Hidden cameras monitored every angle, motion detectors covered the grounds, and communication devices kept all guards in constant contact with the Central Security Office. Yet here he stood, in a uniform design that had barely changed in centuries, carrying a rifle that represented both tradition and very real firepower. The first few hours passed quietly. A delivery van bringing fresh flowers for the staterooms presented proper credentials and was waved through after a routine inspection. The head gardener's truck arrived right on schedule, loaded with equipment for maintaining the pristine lawns that tourists would admire later in the week. 2 maintenance workers showed their identification cards and explained their mission to repair a section of historic stonework that had been damaged by recent storms. James found himself settling into the rhythm of the duty. Check credentials, verify the purpose of the visit, communicate with Central Security if necessary, and either grant or deny access. The process had become almost automatic, but his training emphasized that complacency could be deadly. Every vehicle, every person, every situation demanded full attention and proper procedures. Around mid-morning, the radio crackled with updates from other positions around the castle. The king was beginning his daily schedule, which typically included meetings with advisors, reviewing official documents, and occasionally taking walks in the private gardens. When the monarch was active, everyone remained on higher alert. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the full grandeur of the castle's towers and battlements. Tourist groups began gathering outside the public areas, guided by enthusiasts who shared stories about the castle's 9th-century history. School children pressed against the gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous guards, or perhaps even a member of the royal family. James noticed how the children stared at him with wide eyes, whispering among themselves about his uniform and weapon. He remembered being their age and feeling the same mixture of awe and curiosity about the soldiers who protected important places and people. The responsibility of representing something greater than himself had motivated his decision to join the military, and now he found himself literally standing guard over centuries of British history. A black sedan approached the gate, moving at a normal speed but somehow commanding attention. James straightened and prepared to follow standard procedures. The driver would need to present identification, explain the purpose of the visit, and wait for clearance before proceeding. These steps had been drilled into him hundreds of times during training, and he had executed them flawlessly during his weeks on duty. As the vehicle drew closer, James could see that it appeared to be an official car, possibly from a government ministry or embassy. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to identify the passengers, but that was not unusual for security reasons. Many high-ranking officials preferred privacy when conducting business at the castle. His job was to verify their credentials and authority to enter, regardless of who they might be. The car slowed as it approached the checkpoint, and James stepped forward with practiced precision. His movements were deliberate and professional, exactly as his training had taught him. The driver would lower the window, present the required documents, and explain the nature of their business. If everything checked out, which it usually did, he would wave them through after making the appropriate radio call to confirm the arrival. But something felt different about this particular vehicle. Perhaps it was the way it moved with such obvious authority, or the fact that it seemed to expect automatic passage. James felt his training taking over, heightening his awareness and preparing him to respond to whatever situation might develop. The weeks of repetitive drills and constant emphasis on security protocols had created instincts that now guided his actions. The morning air was crisp and clear. As the black car came to a stop directly in front of his position, James could hear the quiet hum of its engine and the soft whisper of wind through the nearby trees. In moments like this, he was acutely aware of his surroundings and his responsibilities. The ancient stones of the castle seemed to watch over him, reminding him that countless guards before him had stood at this same spot, protecting the same institution he now served. James approached the driver's side of the vehicle, his movements smooth and professional. His rifle remained properly positioned, his posture erect, and his expression appropriately serious. This was the moment where training met reality, where all the hours of preparation would guide his actions. He had no way of knowing that the next few seconds would change his life forever and create ripples that would reach the highest levels of the British establishment. The driver began to lower the window, and James prepared to speak the words he had said dozens of times before. But fate, duty, and circumstance were about to collide in a way that would test everything he had learned about being a royal guard. The split-second decision that would define his military career was only heartbeats away, though he had no idea what storm was about to break over his young shoulders. As the window came down completely, James stepped forward to begin the identification process, unaware that he was about to become the center of a diplomatic incident that would be discussed in newspapers, debated in Parliament, and remembered in royal circles for years to come. The morning that had started so quietly was about to explode into chaos, all because a young soldier chose to follow his orders rather than assume exceptions to the rules that governed his duty. The window descended smoothly, revealing a driver James had never seen before. The man wore a dark suit and appeared professional, but he did not immediately present identification or explain his purpose. Instead, he looked at James with an expression that suggested he expected to be recognized and waved through without question. This was exactly the kind of situation his training had prepared him to handle with firm politeness and unwavering adherence to protocol. James stepped closer to the vehicle and spoke in his clear, trained voice. "Good morning, sir. I need to see identification for all passengers and verification of your authorization to enter castle grounds." His words were polite but firm, exactly as Sergeant Williams had taught him. Security protocols existed for important reasons, and exceptions could not be made based on assumptions or appearances. The driver seemed genuinely surprised by the request. He glanced toward the back seat of the vehicle, then returned his attention to James with a slightly uncomfortable expression. "I believe there may be some misunderstanding, soldier. This is an official vehicle on royal business." His tone carried the subtle implication that further questions were unnecessary and potentially inappropriate. James felt the familiar surge of training taking over his responses. This was precisely the kind of situation where guards could be tested or where genuine security threats might attempt to exploit assumptions about authority and access. His instructors had emphasized repeatedly that polite persistence and strict adherence to procedures were the best defenses against both deliberate deception and honest misunderstandings. "I understand, sir, but I still need to see proper identification and authorization documents. These procedures apply to all vehicles entering the castle grounds, regardless of their official status." James kept his voice respectful but unwavering. He had learned that clear communication and consistent application of rules actually made his job easier and helped avoid larger problems later. From his peripheral vision, James noticed that other guards at nearby positions had become aware of the situation. The delay was unusual enough to attract attention, though not yet concerning enough to trigger immediate backup procedures. His radio remained quiet, indicating that the Central Security Office was monitoring but not intervening. This was his checkpoint and his responsibility to handle according to established protocols. The driver appeared increasingly uncomfortable and glanced again toward the rear passenger area. James could see that someone was indeed seated in the back of the vehicle, though the tinted windows and angle made identification impossible. The passenger had not moved or spoken, which struck James as slightly odd for someone presumably anxious to complete their business at the castle. "Perhaps I should speak with your supervisor," the driver suggested, his tone now carrying a hint of frustration. "This is really quite urgent official business that cannot be delayed by unnecessary formalities." He reached toward what appeared to be a cell phone, as if preparing to make a call that would resolve the situation in his favor. James recognized the tactic immediately. During training, instructors had role-played similar scenarios where individuals attempted to circumvent security procedures by claiming urgency or threatening to involve higher authorities. The proper response was to remain courteous but firm while following established protocols exactly. No legitimate official would object to proper security measures, and anyone who did so immediately raised additional concerns. "Sir, I'm happy to contact my supervisor if you prefer, but the identification requirement will remain the same regardless of who you speak with. These procedures are in place for everyone's safety and cannot be waived." James kept his tone professional while positioning himself to maintain visual contact with all occupants of the vehicle. His training had taught him to be aware of subtle changes in behavior that might indicate escalating problems. The morning sun had climbed higher, and the tourist crowds outside the public areas were growing larger. James could hear the distant sounds of children laughing and tour guides explaining historical details about the castle's architecture. The normal rhythms of daily life continued around them, while this small drama played out at the security checkpoint. The driver made his phone call, speaking in low tones that James could not clearly hear. The conversation lasted several minutes, during which time the traffic behind a black sedan began to back up slightly. A delivery truck waited patiently, followed by what appeared to be a staff member's personal vehicle. Neither seemed particularly concerned about the delay, suggesting that occasional hold-ups at security checkpoints were not uncommon. James used the waiting time to observe the vehicle more carefully. The license plate appeared to be official government issue, and the car itself was clearly expensive and well-maintained. These details supported the driver's claims about official business, but they did not eliminate the need for proper identification and authorization. If anything, the high-profile nature of the vehicle made strict adherence to security protocols even more important. When the driver finished his call, his demeanor had changed noticeably. He appeared more tense and seemed to be struggling with how to proceed. "My supervisor is contacting your command structure to resolve this situation. In the meantime, perhaps we could wait inside the grounds rather than blocking traffic here at the gate." This suggestion immediately triggered additional training responses in James's mind. Moving a vehicle into secure areas before completing identification procedures would violate multiple security protocols simultaneously. The request sounded reasonable on the surface, but it actually represented exactly the kind of compromise that could create serious vulnerabilities. "I'm afraid that's not possible, sir." All identification and authorization requirements must be completed before any vehicle enters the secured areas. "We can certainly wait here while the matter is resolved through proper channels." James maintained his professional tone, while mentally reviewing the escalation procedures he might need to implement if the situation continued to develop problematically.
At this point, James heard his radio crackle with a transmission from Central Security.
The voice was calm but carried an undertone that suggested something unusual was happening. "All stations, be advised that we are coordinating with command regarding a vehicle at the King George IV gate. Maintain normal protocols pending further instructions." The message confirmed that the situation had attracted official attention, but it also reinforced that normal protocols should continue to apply. James felt reassured that his handling of the situation was appropriate, and that higher authorities were monitoring developments. The radio call also indicated that whatever was happening was significant enough to warrant coordination at multiple levels. The driver overheard the radio transmission and appeared to relax slightly, as if the involvement of higher authorities would automatically resolve the matter in his favor. James noticed this change in demeanor but maintained his vigilant posture and continued adherence to established procedures. Training had taught him that assumptions about outcomes could be dangerous, and that his duty remained the same regardless of external pressures. Several more minutes passed with increasing tension. The backup of vehicles behind the black sedan grew longer, and James could see the guards at other positions were maintaining heightened awareness of the developing situation. The normal flow of activity around the castle continued, but there was an underlying current of anticipation that suggested something significant was unfolding. James checked his watch and realized that nearly 20 minutes had elapsed since the vehicle first approached his checkpoint. This was an unusually long delay for what should have been a routine identification and authorization process. Either the occupants of the vehicle were having difficulty producing required documents, or there were complications behind the scenes that he was not aware of. The radio crackled again with another message from Central Security. King George IV Gate, please maintain your position and continue standard protocols. Do not deviate from established procedures regardless of any requests or suggestions to the contrary. We are coordinating with multiple agencies and will provide updated instructions as the situation develops. This transmission carried a more serious tone that suggested the situation was more complex than James had initially realized. The specific instruction to maintain standard protocols regardless of external pressure indicated that someone, somewhere, might be attempting to circumvent normal security procedures. James felt his training and instincts sharpen as he prepared for whatever might come next. The driver made another phone call, this one more animated than the first. James could see him gesturing emphatically and occasionally glancing toward the backseat passenger area. The conversation seemed heated, though the specific words remained inaudible. When the call ended, the driver appeared frustrated and somewhat defeated. This is becoming quite ridiculous, the driver said to James, his professional demeanor beginning to crack under the pressure of the situation. I can assure you that this delay is creating problems far beyond what you can imagine. Surely there must be some way to expedite this process and allow us to proceed with extremely important business. James recognized the appeal to consequences as another classic pressure tactic. His training had specifically addressed situations where individuals attempted to create urgency or suggest that security procedures were causing larger problems. The appropriate response was to acknowledge the concern while maintaining unwavering adherence to established protocols. I understand your frustration, sir, and I'm sure the matter will be resolved as quickly as possible through the proper channels. In the meantime, I need to continue following the security procedures that apply to all vehicles and all situations. James kept his voice calm and professional, though he was beginning to sense that this situation was far from routine. The tension at the checkpoint reached a critical point when James noticed movement in the back seat of the black sedan. The rear passenger door handle turned, and someone began to step out of the vehicle. This development immediately escalated the situation beyond routine identification procedures and into territory that required immediate assessment and response. James instinctively shifted his position to maintain visual contact with all individuals while keeping himself in the best tactical position possible. His training had emphasized that unexpected movements during security stops could indicate anything from innocent frustration to serious security threats. The appropriate response was to remain alert and professional while gathering information about the new development. An elderly gentleman emerged from the vehicle with obvious dignity and authority. He was well dressed in a dark suit and moved with the measured pace of someone accustomed to being in positions of significant responsibility. James immediately noticed the man's bearing and presence, which suggested he was indeed someone of importance. But these observations did not change the security requirements that applied to the situation. The gentleman approached James with a slight smile and an expression that suggested he expected to be recognized immediately. His manner was friendly, but carried the unmistakable confidence of someone who rarely encountered obstacles to his intentions. When he spoke, his voice carried the refined accent and careful diction of someone educated in the finest British institutions. Good morning, young man. I believe there may be some confusion here that I can help to resolve. His tone was pleasant and paternal, the kind of voice that might be used to explain something to a well-meaning but misguided subordinate. I am certain that proper identification can be arranged without further delay to our schedule. James felt every instinct from his training engaging simultaneously. The situation had now evolved from a routine identification check to a face-to-face interaction with someone who clearly held significant authority. However, his protocols remained exactly the same regardless of who he might be dealing with. Security procedures existed to protect everyone, including important officials who might prefer to bypass them. Good morning, sir. I need to see identification for all individuals who will be entering the castle grounds, along with authorization documentation for the purpose of your visit. James maintained his professional tone and posture while carefully observing the gentleman's response to the standard requirement. The elderly man appeared genuinely surprised by the request, as if the concept of being asked for identification was almost incomprehensible. His expression shifted from friendly confidence to puzzled amusement, as though James had made an innocent but rather extraordinary mistake. He glanced back toward the vehicle, then returned his attention to the young guard with renewed patience. My dear fellow, I think perhaps you don't quite understand the situation. I am here for my regularly scheduled morning appointments, and I believe there has been some sort of communication breakdown that has created this unnecessary delay." His voice remained kind but carried subtle undertones that suggested the matter should be resolved immediately through common sense rather than bureaucratic procedures. James felt the weight of the moment settling over him like a heavy cloak. Every element of his training pointed toward the same response, regardless of how important or authoritative the individual might be. Security protocols existed precisely because exceptions and assumptions created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those with harmful intentions. "Sir, I understand that this may be inconvenient, but I am required to verify the identity and authorization of all individuals entering the secure areas of the castle. This requirement applies to everyone without exception, and I need to see your identification documents before I can allow you to proceed." The firmness in James's voice surprised even himself. He had never imagined that he would find himself in a situation where he might be denying access to someone who appeared to be genuinely important and legitimate. But his training had been clear that security could not be compromised by assumptions, appearances, or social pressure. The gentleman's expression shifted again, this time toward what appeared to be growing concern about the unprecedented nature of the situation. He looked around as if expecting someone to appear who might resolve the matter through recognition or authority. When no such resolution appeared forthcoming, he returned his attention to James with renewed seriousness. "Young man, I believe you are making a significant error in judgment that could have consequences far beyond what you might anticipate. Perhaps it would be wise for you to contact your supervisor immediately and explain the situation so that we can resolve this matter appropriately." James recognized the escalation in tone and the subtle threat implicit in the mention of consequences. His training had specifically addressed situations where individuals attempted to intimidate guards into abandoning proper procedures through warnings about repercussions. The appropriate response was to acknowledge the suggestion while maintaining adherence to established protocols. "Sir, my supervisors are already aware of the situation and are coordinating the appropriate response. In the meantime, I must continue to follow security procedures exactly as I have been trained to do. If you have identification documents with you, presenting them would be the fastest way to resolve this matter." At this point, James noticed that guards at other positions around the castle were maintaining heightened awareness of the developing situation. Several had adjusted their positions to provide better visual contact with the checkpoint, and he could see increased radio activity among the security team. The situation had clearly attracted official attention at multiple levels. The elderly gentleman appeared to be struggling with a completely unfamiliar experience. His entire demeanor suggested that he was unaccustomed to being questioned or delayed in any way, much less being required to present identification like a common visitor. He glanced toward the driver, who remained in the vehicle looking increasingly uncomfortable. "This is really quite extraordinary," the gentleman said, his voice now carrying clear frustration. "I have been visiting this castle regularly for many years, and I have never encountered anything like this situation. I am beginning to wonder if there has been some sort of breakdown in communication or training that has created this rather absurd circumstance." James felt the pressure of the moment intensifying, but his resolve remained firm. Every aspect of his military training had emphasized that security protocols existed for important reasons and could not be abandoned when they became inconvenient or socially awkward. The fact that this individual appeared to be genuinely important actually made strict adherence to procedures more crucial, not less. "I understand your frustration, sir, but security procedures are in place to protect everyone, including important visitors to the castle. The fastest way to resolve this situation is to present valid identification so that I can verify your authorization to enter the grounds." The radio on James's belt crackled with another transmission from Central Security. The message was brief but significant. "King George IV Gate, maintain your current position and continue standard identification procedures. Do not deviate from protocol pending arrival of additional supervision. Estimated time of arrival is 5 minutes. This transmission confirmed that the situation was being treated seriously at the highest levels of castle security. The mention of additional supervision indicated that senior personnel were responding personally to oversee whatever was developing. James felt both reassured and concerned by the heightened attention the matter was receiving. The elderly gentleman overheard the radio transmission and appeared to understand its implications. His expression shifted from frustration to what seemed like genuine concern about how the situation was developing. For the first time since exiting the vehicle, he appeared to be considering the possibility that this was not simply a case of bureaucratic confusion. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should wait for your supervisor to arrive, so that this matter can be resolved by someone with appropriate authority to address the unusual circumstances we seem to have encountered." James nodded respectfully. That seems like an appropriate course of action, sir. I'm sure the matter will be clarified quickly once the proper authorities are involved. The next 5 minutes passed in tense silence. James maintained his professional posture and continued monitoring the situation while the elderly gentleman stood nearby, occasionally checking his watch and glancing toward the castle buildings. The driver remained in the vehicle, and the backup of traffic behind them continued to grow. James could hear the approach of footsteps on the cobblestones before he saw Sergeant Williams and another officer approaching the checkpoint. The expressions on their faces suggested that they were dealing with a situation of unusual significance and complexity. As they drew closer, James prepared to brief them on everything that had transpired during the identification process. What happened next would determine not only the immediate resolution of the situation, but also James's future in the Royal Guard service. The split-second decision he had made to follow his training was about to be evaluated by people who understood both the security requirements and the complex social dynamics of royal protection. Sergeant Williams approached the checkpoint with the measured stride of someone who had seen enough unusual situations to remain calm under pressure. Behind him walked Major Harrison, whose presence immediately indicated that this matter had escalated to the highest levels of Castle Security Command. James had never interacted directly with Major Harrison, but every guard knew him by reputation as a veteran of multiple combat deployments who tolerated no compromises when it came to royal protection. As the senior officers drew near, James noticed the elderly gentleman's posture straighten, with what appeared to be relief and expectation. His expression suggested that he anticipated immediate resolution, now that someone with appropriate authority had arrived to address what he clearly viewed as an unfortunate misunderstanding created by an overzealous young guard. Sergeant Williams reached the checkpoint first and quickly assessed the situation. His eyes moved from James to the elderly gentleman to the vehicle and back, taking in every detail with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to reading complex scenarios quickly. When he spoke, his voice carried the professional neutrality that James had learned to respect and emulate. "Private Mitchell, please brief me on the current situation and the actions you have taken." The sergeant's tone was neither approving nor disapproving, simply seeking information on which to base his assessment and response. James recognized this as an opportunity to demonstrate that his handling of the situation had been appropriate and professional. "Sergeant, at approximately 10:15 this morning, this vehicle approached my checkpoint seeking entry to the castle grounds. I requested identification and authorization documents from the driver and all passengers according to standard security protocols. The driver indicated that this was official business but has not yet provided the required documentation. The rear passenger exited the vehicle approximately 15 minutes ago, and I repeated the identification requirement. No documents have been presented, and the individuals have requested supervisory intervention to resolve the matter." James delivered his briefing with the precise factual tone he had been trained to use in such circumstances. He avoided editorial comments or personal opinions, focusing solely on the objective sequence of events and actions taken. This approach demonstrated professional competence while providing his superiors with the information they needed to assess the situation accurately. Major Harrison stepped forward and nodded to James with what appeared to be approval for his clear and comprehensive briefing. Then he turned his attention to the elderly gentleman, and his expression immediately underwent a subtle but significant transformation. The change was almost imperceptible, but James noticed a shift towards something that resembled recognition, and perhaps concern. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Major Harrison said with a respectful nod. "I believe there may have been a communication breakdown that has created this unusual situation. Please allow me to resolve this matter immediately so that you can proceed with your scheduled appointments." The words hit James like a physical blow. "Your Majesty, the elderly gentleman was King Charles III, and James had been following security protocols by demanding identification from the monarch himself." The realization sent waves of shock, embarrassment, and fear coursing through his system as he began to understand the magnitude of what had transpired. King Charles's expression softened with what appeared to be understanding, and perhaps even a hint of amusement at the unprecedented situation. "Major Harrison, I believe this young man has been following his training quite properly, though I must admit this is the first time in many years that I have been asked to present identification to enter my own castle." James felt his knees weaken as the full implications of his actions became clear. He had stopped the king's vehicle, demanded identification from the monarch, and insisted on following security protocols that had never been intended to apply to the royal family themselves. The training that had seemed so clear and appropriate now appeared to have led him into a diplomatic and professional disaster of epic proportions. Sergeant Williams moved closer to James and spoke in a low voice that carried both reassurance and instruction. "Private Mitchell, you have followed your training exactly as you should have. There has been a communication failure that created an unusual set of circumstances, but your response has been entirely appropriate. The sergeant's words provided some comfort, but James remained acutely aware that he had essentially detained the King of England at a security checkpoint. Regardless of the technical correctness of his actions, the situation had created exactly the kind of incident that could end military careers and generate international headlines about royal security failures. Major Harrison was speaking quietly with King Charles, apparently explaining the circumstances that had led to the unusual encounter. James could not hear the specific words, but the king's responses suggested understanding and perhaps even acceptance of the situation as an inevitable result of security procedures that he himself had approved. After several minutes of conversation, Major Harrison returned his attention to James and Sergeant Williams. His expression was serious but not angry, suggesting that the immediate crisis was being managed appropriately. When he spoke, his words carried the authority of someone delivering official guidance on a sensitive matter. Private Mitchell, you have handled this situation exactly as your training required. The communication failure that created these circumstances was not your responsibility, and your adherence to security protocols has been exemplary. However, this incident will require careful documentation and review to ensure that similar situations do not occur in the future. James felt simultaneous relief and continued anxiety. While it appeared that he would not face immediate disciplinary action, the mention of documentation and review suggested that the consequences of this encounter were far from over. The story would undoubtedly become part of his permanent military record and might affect his future assignments and career prospects. King Charles approached James directly, and the young guard instinctively straightened to full attention. The monarch's expression was kind and showed no sign of anger or displeasure with the treatment he had received. When he spoke, his voice carried the warm tone of someone who understood that the situation had resulted from dedication to duty rather than disrespect. Private Mitchell, I want you to know that I harbor no ill will regarding this morning's events. You have demonstrated exactly the kind of diligence and commitment to security that I expect from the guards who protect this castle and my family. While the circumstances were unusual, your actions were entirely proper. The king's words provided enormous relief, but James remained concerned about the broader implications of the incident. He had learned enough about royal protocol during his training to understand that stopping the monarch's vehicle and demanding identification was unprecedented in modern times. The story would inevitably spread through military and royal circles, potentially making him a figure of either admiration or ridicule. Sergeant Williams stepped forward to address the practical resolution of the immediate situation. Your Majesty, we will ensure that communication protocols are reviewed and updated to prevent similar circumstances in the future. In the meantime, would you prefer to proceed to your scheduled appointments, or would you like to address any other aspects of this matter? King Charles glanced once more at James, then smiled slightly. I think we should proceed with the day's business. However, I would like to suggest that Private Mitchell's actions this morning demonstrate exactly the kind of security mindset that serves this institution well. Perhaps there are lessons here that could benefit the entire Guard service. The suggestion that his actions might be viewed as exemplary rather than problematic provided James with hope that his career might survive this unprecedented encounter. However, he remained acutely aware that the ultimate judgment would come from military superiors and royal officials, who would need to balance security effectiveness with diplomatic sensitivity. As King Charles returned to his vehicle, Major Harrison provided final instructions to James and Sergeant Williams. The checkpoint would return to normal operations, but the incident would be thoroughly documented and analyzed to identify any systemic issues that needed to be addressed. James would continue his regular duties while the review process was conducted. The black sedan finally proceeded through the checkpoint and into the castle grounds, bringing the immediate crisis to an end. James remained at his position, but his mind was racing with thoughts about how this single encounter would affect his military service and his family's reaction to the story that would inevitably reach them. The morning had begun as a routine duty shift, and had evolved into a career-defining moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Whether that memory would be positive or negative remained to be determined by forces beyond James's control. The hours following the incident passed in a blur of documentation, interviews, and anxious waiting. James completed his checkpoint duty with heightened awareness of every vehicle and every procedure, but his mind kept returning to the moment when he had demanded identification from the King of England. The reality of what had transpired seemed almost surreal, like something that might happen in a comedy film rather than real military service. Sergeant Williams appeared at the checkpoint near the end of James's shift, carrying a folder that presumably contained initial reports about the morning's events. His expression was neutral but professional, suggesting that the immediate administrative response was proceeding according to established procedures. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured tone of someone delivering important information. Private Mitchell, you are to report to Major Harrison's office at 1400 hours for a complete debriefing and review of this morning's incident. You should be prepared to provide a detailed written account of your actions and the reasoning behind your decisions. This is standard procedure for unusual security events and should not be interpreted as indicating disciplinary action. James nodded his understanding while feeling renewed anxiety about the formal review process. Military debriefings could be thorough and intense, designed to extract every detail about decisions and actions taken during significant events. He would need to explain not only what he had done, but also why he had chosen specific courses of action when alternatives might have been available. The remaining hours of his shift passed quietly, but James noticed that other guards occasionally glanced in his direction with expressions that suggested word of the incident was beginning to spread through the castle's security force. Some looks appeared sympathetic, others curious, and a few seemed to carry the kind of professional respect that comes from recognizing someone who had faced an unprecedented situation and handled it appropriately. When James arrived at Major Harrison's office that afternoon, he found not only the major but also a colonel he did not recognize, and a civilian who appeared to be some sort of security specialist or investigator. The presence of multiple senior officials indicated that the incident was being treated as a significant event requiring comprehensive analysis and documentation. Major Harrison began the debriefing by explaining that the review was designed to understand how the communication breakdown had occurred and what systemic changes might be needed to prevent similar incidents in the future. James would not be held responsible for circumstances beyond his control, but his actions and decision-making process would be carefully examined to identify any lessons that might benefit the entire royal protection system. Over the next 2 hours, James provided detailed accounts of every aspect of the morning's events. The officials asked probing questions about his training, his understanding of protocols, and his reasoning for specific actions at various points during the encounter. They seemed particularly interested in his decision to maintain standard procedures, even when faced with obvious authority and pressure to make exceptions. The civilian investigator proved to be especially thorough in exploring the psychological and tactical aspects of James's responses. He wanted to understand how training had influenced decision-making under pressure, and whether additional preparation might help other guards handle similar unexpected situations. The questions suggested that the incident was being viewed as a valuable case study rather than simply an embarrassing mistake. As the debriefing concluded, Major Harrison provided James with preliminary feedback about how the situation was being assessed by military and royal officials. The consensus was that his adherence to security protocols had been exemplary and that any criticism should be directed toward communication systems rather than individual performance. However, the final evaluation would require input from multiple agencies and levels of authority. During the following days, James found himself at the center of intense but largely invisible activity as various officials investigated every aspect of the incident. Security procedures were reviewed, communication protocols were analyzed, and training programs were examined to identify potential improvements. The young guard who had simply tried to do his job properly had become the catalyst for a comprehensive security review. The story began to leak beyond official circles within a week of the incident. Initially appearing as brief mentions in military newsletters and security publications, it gradually attracted attention from mainstream media outlets, intrigued by the unprecedented nature of a royal guard demanding identification from the monarch. Most coverage was sympathetic to James, portraying him as a dedicated soldier who had followed his training despite extraordinary circumstances. King Charles himself contributed to the positive narrative by making subtle references to the incident during public appearances and interviews. He praised the professionalism of the Castle Guard service and emphasized that security procedures existed to protect everyone, including the royal family. His gracious response helped establish James as a figure of professional competence rather than embarrassing failure. The formal review concluded after 3 weeks with a comprehensive report that praised James's actions while identifying several systemic issues that had contributed to the communication breakdown. New protocols were established to ensure that royal family members' scheduled movements would be properly coordinated with all security positions. James received an official commendation for his adherence to duty under extraordinary circumstances. The incident also led to broader changes in royal security training. James's experience became a case study used to prepare other guards for situations where following established procedures might conflict with social expectations or apparent authority. The lesson emphasized was that security could not be compromised by assumptions, regardless of how reasonable those assumptions might seem. 6 months after the incident, James received notification that he had been selected for advanced training and promotion opportunities within the Royal Protection Service. His demonstrated ability to maintain professional standards under extreme pressure had marked him as someone with exceptional potential for increased responsibility. The career damage he had feared had instead become a career enhancement. The story of Private Mitchell's split-second decision eventually became legendary within British military and security circles. It was told as an example of how proper training and unwavering commitment to duty could produce correct actions even in the most unexpected and challenging circumstances. James had become an inadvertent symbol of professional military values. Years later, when James had achieved senior rank and was responsible for training new guards, he would tell his own story to emphasize the importance of following established procedures regardless of external pressure. He would explain that security protocols existed for important reasons and that exceptions, no matter how reasonable they might seem, could create vulnerabilities that endangered everyone. The incident also had lasting effects on royal security culture. It demonstrated that even the most unusual circumstances could be handled professionally when guards were properly trained and committed to their duties. The story became part of the institutional memory of the Royal Protection Service, reminding all personnel that their primary obligation was to security rather than convenience or social comfort. King Charles, for his part, occasionally referenced the encounter in private conversations as an example of the dedication and professionalism of the men and women who protected his family. He would note that being asked for identification at his own castle had been initially surprising but ultimately reassuring, as it demonstrated that security procedures were being followed without exception or compromise. The morning that had begun with routine checkpoint duty had evolved into a career-defining moment that influenced not only James's future, but also the broader culture of royal security. His split-second decision to follow training over assumption had created ripple effects that continued long after the initial incident was resolved. In the end, Private James Mitchell's choice to demand identification from King Charles III became a testament to the value of proper training, professional dedication, and unwavering commitment to duty. What had seemed like a potential disaster had instead become an example of military service at its best, demonstrating that following established procedures and maintaining professional standards could produce positive outcomes even in the most extraordinary circumstances. The split-second decision that had stopped a king's car had ultimately strengthened the very institution it had seemed to challenge, proving that security and respect could coexist when both were grounded in professional competence and mutual understanding.